All right. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Super excited for Yeeboo Digital's presentation this Wednesday. We're talking with the amazing Carla Chadwick. I'm going to let her introduce herself in a second about keeping your campaign creatives fresh and how to keep fresh ideas in the space. And while this applies to all nonprofits, new creatives are always great. Carla is a professional that's been in the industry for a very long time and has a great take on legacy nonprofits. And she's going to define all of that, what it means. Super excited to have her today. And of course, Yeeboo Digital, just quick, we empower nonprofits to lead with digital marketing and fundraising agencies. So we do everything from donor acquisition, top of funnel work, all the way through to fundraising campaigns and strategy conversations. But really the focus today is on everything that Carla knows. So Carla, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Tasha. It's so nice to be here with you. I am Carla Chadwick. As Tasha mentioned, I've been in the industry for a little over 22 years, which means that I go back to the days of plain text emails and dial-up internet connections. And been in consulting, been on the nonprofit side. I've done a lot, and I think you'll see some of the work I've done. So I'm not going to go into this whole long bio of who I am.
No, this is awesome and really fortunate. I was just starting out still at Yeeboo, and one of my colleagues, Eric, who Carla has a history with, introduced us. And it was just kind of on a whim. Here's someone cool in the industry. We're doing year-end giving. We don't know what to do with you yet, Tasha. Here's Carla. And it was just I loved the conversation. So great. And so a lot of the things we talked about, Carla was like, this is an entire LinkedIn Live, if not a training that Carla could offer. So this is great. And
I just have to say, like, Eric and the Yeeboo team and I have been like joined at the hip for like 15 years. It seems like every path I go on, they're sort of there with me. So, shout out to Eric and the team. You guys are amazing.
Awesome. Thank you. That's so wonderful. And Carla has graciously said, if people have comments, questions, throw them in the chat and we'll try to kind of do it in real time. And yes, Blaine here says Carla is the best. We totally agree.
Hi, Blaine.
Yes. Okay, so Carla brought us some incredible slides today. And normally I'm not a slide queen, but Carla has put some fire together for us today. So keeping your campaign creative fresh. And I'm going to let Carla kind of take it from here.
So we kind of decided to make this conversation about 4 questions to kind of guide us through. And the first is like, what is a legacy nonprofit? So you'll see on the next slide, there's a really literal definition for what it means if we go by kind of Webster. But it's not always the case that it's some organization that's been around for a really long time or that has a huge history from bygone era. In many cases, some of the examples that we're going to talk about today are ones that are 10 years old or less. And I think you'll understand what that means as we start to dig into them.
All right, perfect.
So the big question, and why I think, Tasha and I have been talking about this on and off for, I think, a month now, is, how can marketing be challenging for a legacy nonprofit? And first and foremost, what defines these organizations is a message that created who they are and their brand. So one of the biggest challenges is the evolution of mission. And show of hands in the comment through a yes, how many people knew that March of Dimes was actually started as a organization to help fund for the cure for polio? So just put a yes or no in the comment field, because not a lot of people know that history. And, obviously we found a vaccine for polio and slowly but surely we're eradicating polio in this country. So March of Dimes evolved to be all birth defects. And so there was this shift in messaging there. And then over time, and as science began to evolve, they realized that by helping mothers have healthy pregnancies, they would help address some of these birth defects. So it was this evolution from a very specific disease to the problems children face to the problems mothers face. So this huge evolution in time. And I can't see the comment fields, Tasha, but did most people know it or not a lot of people?
I was going to say we had someone who had no idea, someone who did, which I'm super impressed, because when you showed me and we were talking about this, it blew my mind. I mean, I love the evolution of where they've gone with the message, because in many ways, I mean, as science advances, of course, we should start looking at what prevents the need, right, for some of these treatments in the first place, and vaccines and all of those different pieces. But that's pretty cool where they've gone from, and I love the fact you brought these visuals in with us, because this is great.
So the next thing that organizations kind of struggle with, especially as legacies, is evolution and messaging. So this is an example of when I was working at Covenant House. So when I came in, they had just hired their first layperson to run the organization, but direct mail was still very religious, used words like God and Jesus and saving souls. And there was still a sister who was signing some of the planned giving appeals. It was definitely not a message that was going to translate very well to a growing digital acquisition program. So, here we had to lead the conversation in expanding messaging. We at the time were one of the leading providers of help for victims of human trafficking. We also were taking care of LGBT youth. Like 40% of our kids were LGBT youth, and that didn't resonate well with the direct mail audience. But in the digital world, it really was how we were able to acquire hundreds of thousands of new donors. And the interesting thing is that this was all happening at a time when the entire industry was talking about integration. And we made a decision not to integrate. Like, we kept our digital, and our direct mail. We couldn't lose our legacy donors. I mean, these were the heart and soul of our direct mail program, but we could acquire digital donors who were completely different than our direct mail. So it was an interesting decision to make at a time where everybody in the world thought we were crazy to do something so siloed.
I love that. And I mean, there's really some interesting conversations on LinkedIn. I don't know if you've connected with Mike Dworkson, but he does a lot of direct mail conversations about direct mail. And there's still a clear place for direct mail, and it can be complementary or separate, I guess, too, from your digital marketing. But I love that. And I guess that comes back to segmentation too, of who, how do people want to be communicated with? What's your demographic, geography, and all those pieces too. So this is great.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of knowing your donor and knowing your key stakeholders, because you need to have both. You need to have an internal conversation that supports something like this. And then you need to know the donors and what channels that they're responding in. So a lot went into this. It wasn't just hey, let's go do this. We had to really get buy-in from people within the organization.
Interesting. And now, just because I love CRM conversations, were you managing all of this in one CRM, or was it in separate, or how did you manage the two types of marketing?
It was in one CRM, which I think was key. And also really making a decision that because everything was in one CRM, new digital donors would not go into direct mail, because there was such a disconnect. And, at the time, we were really trying to get multi-channel donors. It was like the other catchphrase, integration, omni-channel donors. So having it all in one CRM, we could easily suppress digital donors from direct mail, so they weren't going to get a Lent appeal after they got an LGBT youth email series.
Love it.
So it was really important that we had everything in one place.
Cool.
So the next kind of challenge is evolution and need. So we used to joke at Covenant House that our ultimate goal was to be out of business one day, that there would not be children who needed homes. But this is one organization that truly did have a problem that they were addressing, and the problem slowly started to go away. So this is an organization in New York called God's Love We Deliver. It was started by Joan Rivers, the comedian, and it was started in the 80s in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. And for those of you who are old enough like me to remember it, it was a very dark time in our city. And, there were homebound AIDS patients who couldn't get food. I mean, it was just horrible. And so this organization was like a Meals on Wheels for AIDS patients.
Wow.
And thankfully, through time, one, we have become much more of a caring society, I believe. And two, we have nearly eradicated the AIDS epidemic here in the United States. So there's still AIDS, there's still HIV, but it's a manageable disease, and it's not the diagnosis of death it was in the 80s. But this is an organization that was so rooted in helping community and people in need that they shifted. And so first they started to take care of any homebound patients that were in need, mostly cancer. And then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and it was like they were there. Like they had the model, they had the resources, they knew what they were doing. And in a time where people were isolated and couldn't go out, they were there and they were ready to do it. So the need for their services could have put them out of business, the need going away, but they just evolved. They changed and found people who did need those meals. So I just love this organization, by the way. If you don't know them, check them out.
I'm going to have to for sure, because, and especially, I mean, New York City, the beginning of the pandemic, it was one of the epicenters, right? That everyone was watching going, what is going on there? So I can only imagine how valuable this kind of service was.
So the next thing is kind of recent in my experience, which is evolution of brands. So when I was working at Comic Relief, I would tell people I work for Comic Relief, and they would say, who's that? And I'd say, oh, we're the Red Nose Day people. And then people would be like, oh, we know who you are. And Red Nose Day is this amazing campaign. It happens every year. It's several months long. It's in the Walgreens stores. But that's once a year. And we were an organization that were helping people all year round and funding grants all year round. And there was this real need to start trying to evolve our brand so people knew us beyond just the red nose. Like that could not just be our brand. Our brand had to be help end intergenerational poverty. So just even that was a challenge because it was a relatively new organization, but people really truly knew us for the nose and not the brand. So these are some of the challenges that, we see. And you can probably go to the next one. So the question is, what are we going to do to handle these? Like, how do we bring fresh creative into these kind of very established brands, missions, organizations, voices, while still kind of paying homage to kind of where these people are and how they got there? And more importantly, how do we pay respect to donors who have been there the whole journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. This is great. I can't wait.
So this was a little bit of what was going on at Covenant House. So in the questions, how many people kind of remember when direct marketing was all about telling the backstory, and kind of the more we expressed need and the more we talked about urgency, the more we raised money, and it was on guilt. Like, just yes or no, do you guys remember that sort of model of creative? I think it was really common in so many places, especially places like Covenant House, where we're really taking care of kids in need. So it was hard to shift. And Tasha, I saw you were about to say something. Were you going to jump in?
I was just thinking, even personally, about being a kid and, Saturday morning cartoons, and you'd end up with the half-hour World Vision segment that was really hard, even as a kid, which I didn't understand a lot of the implications of any of this, seeing that come on. And yeah, I was going to say, I've got a little comment come in, right? So that style of marketing, I remember it from well before I was in marketing in any way. So
yeah, I think we all can remember like the pictures in supermarkets of the really, really, really abused dog and the little change container. It was what worked, but it's like now we've moved towards this ethical storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's hard because we had tested into this hundreds of times. Like, we fought back in the beginning to this change. I am going to say that this did not come easy because, you work so hard in program growth and seeing numbers go up and up and up, and you figure you've got the magic sauce, you know what works. Like, why am I going to change it? Well, first of all, the whole world was changing. Like, we weren't the only nonprofit going through this, and I'm sure many of you on this webinar have had the similar situation where you don't want to change because it's working, it's making money.
Yeah.
But in the long run, it empowers donors. And yes, there might be some donors who were expecting to see that really, really gruesome backstory so they can feel that need to give. But showing the positive outcome empowers both the donor and the recipient of that generosity. And it plays on that empowerment. And so this was a tough, tough move. And I think a lot of nonprofits really understand this. So there's also changes in need. And why we have to show that change is so important. So sometimes change comes gradually, and other times it comes with a monumental shutting of a door. And working with No Kid Hungry, this was the case. I mean, one day, all the schools in America just closed. This is an organization, if you're not familiar with, they decided that the way to end childhood hunger is to ensure children have a school breakfast and an after-school meal. So combined with school lunch programs, you're getting kids 3 meals a day. And they had reduced childhood hunger by a third before the pandemic hit. So they were moving in the right direction. But their mission was so specific. It was like, give $10, get 10 meals. There was no variation on that. It was so simple. And then all of a sudden, kids just didn't get to go to school anymore. And it was interesting because working with them at the time, they said that they were so ready for that moment in time because they had boots on the ground. They were advocates in the government. They knew what to do and how to react quickly. So now it just was a matter of showing the donors, like, why No Kid Hungry was the place to go to get meals to children, even outside of school. And it was chaotic. It was crazy. It was like we were developing messaging without messaging guides, and they didn't even know where their grants were going to, but they just knew that if anybody could come to them with a solution, they were going to fund it. And so we were kind of just riding that wave with them as they were evolving into this amazing emergency response organization. And in the end, they raised $25 million and helped provide 1.1 billion meals to children in the first year of the pandemic. So it was really incredible. And it's just a matter of showing those donors why, and then showing the impact of what they were doing.
I really like this example because I think oftentimes when you've been working somewhere for a long time, there's a lot of discussions of marketing strategy and long-term campaigns and often marketing is that a big strategy, a big, long plan in advance, but sometimes it needs to be nimble. And this is a great example. And that's not going to apply to every nonprofit out there, but I think it does show that it is possible to be nimble and on your feet and try something new as well. And you're not always going to have a year's worth of strategy time to put into play a new message. So this is a great example. I love this one.
Yeah. And I think, not every organization is going to be affected by a Hurricane Sandy, and not every organization is going to be affected by an earthquake in Syria and Turkey. But here, the whole world was affected by this. So everybody kind of has gone through this now. And I think even if you weren't in emergency response, you had to pivot for the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I think it taught us all as fundraisers a really good lesson on how to break out of that mold. Even if, I was working with the Seeing Eye at the time, and they were devastated. They were like, we're just going to go out of business because nobody will fund us during a pandemic. We're raising Seeing Eye dogs for people who are blind. And the magical thing is that they addressed it. They talked about it. They talked about the extra need required to raise puppies in a pandemic, and they raised money. So I think even organizations that didn't even seem connected to it were able to change.
This is great. Okay.
So the next thing too is that if you are on this road to evolution and you are a legacy, um, you are very protective of those donors who you've had the whole time. And so part of it is just sort of connecting the old to the new, being good storytellers. Why are we doing this? Why is this important in our history? Have them be part of the journey with you. Let them know that they're fueling this change, that this change is not only good, but if it wasn't for them, you would not be in that position to grow and create a new legacy. And yes, you may lose some donors along the way, but this idea to change and adapt will attract many, many, many new donors who will look at your broad legacy and say, wow, these aren't guys that are fly by night. These are guys who've been through lots and lots of stuff and they're still here and they're still making an impact. And I think, God's Love We Deliver did a really, really good job of both celebrating their history, where they've come from, and then demonstrating, like, hey, this is what we did to address COVID-19. Here's where we are today, and here's how we got here. So that journey and that storytelling is really important, even if your mission does change.
Yeah, I really like that. And we talked a little bit the last LinkedIn Live we did about storytelling and that idea of a journey and an extended conversation, right? That, yes, you have a campaign with 5 emails, let's say, but what about over a year? What about over 2 years? What about 3 years? And how do you bring a journey that somehow feels slightly connected to all of these different campaigns, because there's this overarching discussion about what your nonprofit provides, right? At a like a high scale level too.
Totally agree.
All right.
So the next thing is to
leads in perfectly. I was going to say, be more than a campaign. That's great.
Be more than a campaign. So this is another question. I think we all learned, especially during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, there were organizations that had galas. There were organizations that had huge peer-to-peer fundraising programs.
Right.
All these things kind of had to go away. And now people had to sort of go back to sort of this mission-driven idea of acquisition. And so I'd love to just see, like, we came up with, obviously, Red Nose Day, Ice Bucket Challenge, Late the Night, Relay for Life. But I'd love to know, like, other examples that you guys have heard of where organizations really were relying on their kind of premier tentpole moment to be the driver of their mission. So I'd love to know other examples, because I think a lot of nonprofits really struggled with how to replace that, or if not replace it, change it and build it up, pivot it from one channel to another.
I'll let people throw hopefully some ideas in the comment of someone they know, but I, at the time during COVID, was working with a very small nonprofit, so I'll use their example, but they had a night with Cora, and that was their premier kind of, like a large portion of their funding came in for this live gala style event, like you talked about. And small team just totally embraced online, right? And it was wild to see what they managed to accomplish, and it felt uncomfortable and no one was sure how it was going to go and everything, but it allowed them to kind of keep doing it, through 2 years when in person was just not an option or didn't feel safe enough. And I think this last October was the first time they did it in person again. And it was very exciting, right? For everybody too. It was great to get back in person, but it took a lot of work. And like you said, the large portion of funding, one evening, and the lead up to it was always, 2 months of promo and all of those stuff. So, all right. I didn't have any examples come through, so we'll just let you continue there, Carla.
Okay.
You gave some good ones already too. Like the other ones that are on the top of my head would have been the Ice Bucket Challenge for sure.
Yeah, I was trying to think, like, of the nonprofits that were affected when the New York City Marathon just got canceled, and then the Boston, all these really huge fundraising initiatives that kind of piggyback these big endurance events. And I was trying to think of who the nonprofit was, who the first one to say, let's do a virtual, because people were out running. They had to get out of their apartments. They were going nuts. Running was a solo thing you could do, but you could raise money and track your miles. And for the life of me, I cannot remember who the first one was that did it, but a lot of people sort of follow suit. So another example.
Nice.
But then we talk about, if you want to go to the next slide,
Sure.
how do you know if this is working? Because obviously change is very scary, and you have to report back to people, and you can't just go do these things at whim, obviously, unless there's a pandemic. But hopefully, we have been there, done that.
I was going to say, move on from that. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say your mission is evolving, or your message is evolving, or your brand is evolving. How are you going to message this? And the first thing you want to do is retention, retention, retention. You have worked really hard. All of us work really hard to get new donors and retain them. So you want to keep your eye on how those people are staying on, but it's not just your overall retention. Definitely you want to make sure that the new people you're bringing on are engaging with this new direction, new brand, new voice, whatever it is, but also keep your eye on your multi-year donors and your mid-level donors. Like, those are your barometers of like how this change is working. And, obviously that's why we invented segmentation. The change may be slower for certain audiences than new people who didn't know you before. And of course, this is a really good reason why we want to push monthly giving, because we get the highest retention from people who are just giving monthly. So really important measurement. The next thing is test and test again. So, we all are aware of the fact that like open rates are no longer a thing that we can measure, but start to really rely more on click-through rates. That's your real true sense of engagement. Test everything, test images, test creative, test, voice, test everything you can think of, and then learn from your testing. A lot of people test and then they don't know what to do with that testing. Let that testing tell you, give you learnings that you can adapt to, and then test into that more and more. And if necessary, use those learnings to guide your segmentation strategy. Your multi-year donors may not be as comfortable with one thing as they are with another thing. So test within segments as much as you're just testing across your whole audience.
All right. That's really good advice for sure. And I probably should take more of that to heart myself as I work on my own email strategy and everything. It's so easy to just send out, those mass emails, and those do have a place and a time for sure. But especially like you're talking with that move to more monthly donors, and retention strategy should be very different across segments, right?
Yeah, I mean, a great example of this strategy was with No Kid Hungry. So, No Kid Hungry really talked to the donors who had been there all throughout their history differently than new donors. New donors, it was all about emergency response, all about emergency response. They didn't know who No Kid Hungry was before. The donors who had supported No Kid Hungry all along needed to be reminded that they had gotten us to this place, and they were the reason that the foundation was there to be able to make such an impact during such a period of time. And then what's interesting is, because it was such a long period of time, then we had to pivot the other way, where we had to start teaching new donors who've been on file for a year, hey, this isn't really what we do. What we really do is in schools, and schools are opening again. So it was kind of like, this is where your testing and your segmentation really need to go hand in hand.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know there was quite an inflooding among hospital foundations and, groups that were connected to medical care services, a huge influx of one-time donors frequently, right? And I know that that's a real struggle. Now, what's the donor stewardship plan for these individuals who came in during COVID? COVID is over, as much as I hate to use the phrase, because who knows exactly, and I don't want to jinx anything. But I do think that within the hospital and healthcare system, there's still a great need. We're Canadians, so I mean, universal healthcare, but also with challenges. And there's still a great need within the hospital system for supports. But that's a very different ask than when healthcare workers weren't able to take vacations and were frontline at the beginning of a pandemic. Those are two very different comments and questions. and conversations, right, to have with donors.
Excellent example. I mean, the healthcare industry really is one perfect example of that. Even America here, it was a perfect example. And I'm very aware of time. We only have 2 more slides, so
Yes.
we'll go through them first.
Nice.
So obviously, the best way you can measure your overall performance in this kind of shift, if you have one, is the revenue that's coming in. You need to monitor performance month over month, year over year. Measure your program against industry standards. If you guys are not using M&R benchmarks, use M&R benchmarks. They're not an exact science, but they are the most comprehensive benchmark for all of us, and it's broken down by sector. So some sectors may be seeing tremendous growth and others may be seeing declines. So if you're in that sector, don't necessarily beat yourself up. If you're going in that direction, follow the trends, and then set reasonable expectations. Like, adjust your goals. If your campaign is brand new and it's replacing a legacy campaign, it's not going to perform the same way. Give it a couple of years to get some traction. Understand the impact of all this on your list. Why is money going down or going up? Again, go back into those segments and monitor over time. This is not going to be something that you will determine win or lose in the next month or so.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the last slide talks about the things that can't be measured. Breaking down your internal silos, working as a team across departments helps navigate change better. It just works. And I know this sounds kind of redundant at this point because we've all talked about breaking down silos, but it really, really does work. And create consensus on how to build audience trust. I mean, there has to be buy-in from all organizational departments, but this is your opportunity to lead if you're leading this direction of change. And then build your network of thought leaders. If you are active in social, get your C-suite community to be talking about this, get influencers to be talking about it. If they are preaching for you, it helps bolster your change in your new direction.
I love this. And there is a question that came in just based on, I think, the last slide from Kathy here about your donor list. So how large does it need to be in order for this testing kind of to be useful and valid?
That's a really, really good question, Kathy. And, obviously there is a difference between statistical significance and directional significance. And I think these days, most nonprofits don't have large enough lists because we're all doing hygiene, we're all purging, and protecting our deliverability. So as lists shrink, we're getting a smaller audience. But I think you have to be willing to define what is acceptable directional significance. You may not get enough data to say this is the true winner, but if you start to see a trend over 4 or 5 emails, hey, it's only a 2 or 3 or 4% difference. It's enough of a directional, I think, significance to let you continue testing into that. But it's a great question because a lot of nonprofits don't have files big enough to test into.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, many of them don't. But I mean, legacy nonprofits, you would think of groups that do it have a decent size to test with. It probably would be that within that space. So Carla's awesome. Obviously, this is incredible.
Thank you.
You're so wonderful. But if there are any other questions, we'll just give a minute here. And I think we had a little bit of a disconnect at some point with the comment section, heads up, because all of a sudden like 4 came in at once with weird timestamps. So, but this is good. And yes, and Kathy says, Carla, it's great to see you. So this is nice.
Hey,
I love the nonprofit community is so great. I love LinkedIn because it allows you to stay in touch with people you haven't had a chance to work with or know from a project forever ago. And all of this was just so valuable. I love it. And I know, I'm just supporting nonprofits, but I mean, there are people doing this legwork, and I think it is scary to try new things. I get, a little nervous. New messaging, new ideas can feel a little uncomfortable, right? For all of us.
Yeah. And, I don't have access to the chat for some reason, but Tasha is going to Throw my email address
Yes.
into the chat for you. So if you have any more questions or just want to chat, I think what's so great about our industry is we're so collaborative and do a lot of idea sharing. So please keep in touch if anything kind of comes to mind. I'd be glad to
Yeah.
continue the conversation.
Oh, there is one. We're going to do one question, then I'm going to let everybody
Great.
go. But this is a crazy question. So I mean, that feels like maybe I should send her your email address because that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to chat with you offline. I think it is a
Yeah,
really important question, and I think it could take a lot of time to answer. So I don't want to do it here, but
sure.
please keep in touch, and I'd
Yeah.
love to talk to you about
Yeah. And here, look at Eric's on the call from Costa Rica, actually.
it.
So saying thank you. And Carla, this has just been so fantastic. Thank you for letting us just pick your brain because,
So
not everyone has 20 years of nonprofit experience to reach back on and see the evolution of what's happened. And so it's a real pleasure for all of us to be able to have that conversation with you.
thank you so much for asking, and thanks, Eric, for connecting me to Tasha, who's amazing.
Oh, thank you. This is really fun. All right. Cheers, everybody. Happy Wednesday. And thanks. This will go out afterwards. You can review and I'll send Carla's information along to people. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.